I'm Chris Terranova, and this is the Generational Exchange. 4 generations, 1 conversation. All right, welcome back. And we have our panel back together again for another episode of our podcast representing perspectives from people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. As usual, we have Rhett Suchu back representing the 30s. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
And representing the perspective of the 40-somethings, we have Jeremy Davidson. Good to see you again, Jeremy.
Glad to be here.
And I know we were talking about this earlier, but I really do have listeners who want to know about the baby goats when they're born. So you're going to have to post some pictures or something on our channel when those are born. So we're going to hold you to that.
10 days or so, 10 days and counting. So we'll keep everybody posted.
Right. And then representing the 60s is our good friend and mentor and all-around great guy, Mark Russell. Mark?
Hello, my friends. Great to be here.
And last and maybe least, I don't know, I'm the moderator and representing the viewpoint of someone in their 50s. To learn more about us as panelists, please listen to our previous podcast, but you can also go down to our individual links for LinkedIn, which are in the notes of the podcast itself. So today's topic is work-life balance. What is it, how to get it, and why it's important. So let's get our exchange started. Back in the mid-2000s, the term work-life balance was the new catchphrase or topic being discussed by HR professionals, employees, and management. How could you give employees the latitude to balance the personal demands outside the office while still achieving the productivity or work that needed to be accomplished? Or was working 50 to 60 hours a week more productive, and did it cause burnout and dissatisfaction? As we'll discuss with our panel and from our own recent experiences over the last decades, for some of us, we've experienced this both as individual contributors and managers seeking and finding the right balance for our direct teams and organizations. So, Rhett, to kick us off, I know you did some research on work-life balance earlier. Can you share a bit about what you found?
Absolutely. If you were to do a quick search on work-life balance, you'll get no less than about 1,000 articles, even from just the start of January. Additionally, even today, Gallup research will share that personal well-being is the new term for work-life balance, which results in employee engagement and satisfaction. We will address in future conversations the impacts of employee engagement and satisfaction, working from home versus hybrid models, the ongoing dynamics of the return to the office trends, and still we are challenged with the great resignation of the post-COVID era. But today, we will focus on the what work-life balance means to us.
Well, so starting with that, go ahead, Jeremy. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say we could probably even toss quiet quitting into that list, right? There's been so many new trends here in the last even half a dozen years.
Yeah, there's all kinds of trends happening in the workplace, which is why I think some of these conversations are really important, right? Because everybody's trying to get their hand around some of these buzzwords, and they're a little harder than you would think to sometimes define. And, taking work-life balance as an example, I was looking up how to define work-life balance, and it really took me a long time to even find kind of a cohesive definition. And even this I don't love, but at least it gets you started thinking about it. So I went to a website called HR Zone, and it defined work-life balance as the level of prioritization between personal and professional activities in an individual's life and the level to which activities related to their job are present in the home. That kind of gives you a sense of what work-life balance is. But given, as Rhett said earlier, we have remote and hybrid working and everything, keeping work out of your home is not always as easy as it sounds. And that balance is going to be harder and harder to find. I do think it's possible, though, right? And so I think as we go through, we're going to talk about that a little bit, about our experiences and, some of the tips and tricks that we've learned. And we're going to give some ideas of how to establish a work-life balance. But before we get into all that, Jeremy, I think you have some stats as well that you came up with from Gallup.
Oh, yeah. Although nothing super surprising. Gallup supports somewhere north of 60% of folks as they, flesh out what's important to them in their job search. What are they looking for? they're highlighting that personal well-being element, right, as being kind of a 60% motivating factor, what they're looking for. They're wanting that work-life balance. And I don't think that jumps out as a big surprise to anybody here who's done hiring in the last couple of years, that trend just comes up and comes up and comes up.
I think it's an interesting stat, though, given that I think for all of us, we talk about work-life balance. I would think the number would be higher, right? But I think that also goes to some of the generational experience with work-life balance that we're going to get into. And in fact, I found an article from Carbon HQ that kind of defines what work-life balance means to each generation. I thought it was a great read. It's simple, but it kind of goes into each generation. And Mark, maybe starting with you based on the article, boomers. And by the way, for everybody who doesn't know, the boomer generation is defined from 1946 to 1964. But according to this article, boomers value working hard and appreciate the opportunity to work because they were familiar with the hardships of the Great Depression. They crave stability and don't see work-life balance as a priority. So, Mark, do you find this as your experience? I mean, you've been working since the early 80s. You've probably got some of that there. I think you're on the tail end of the boomers, but still, tell us a little bit about your experience with your career and maybe how that's evolved as you've worked through.
Yeah, Chris, thanks. And yes, I am at the tail end of that boomer generation. However, it was that hard work and appreciation for work that I learned from my parents because, yes, they were in the Depression era. And they saw the ups and downs and everything. And luckily, as we all came out of it. But, for me, part of it was early in my career. I was at a sheriff's department. Many of the folks there, the leadership, the superiors, all came from military backgrounds. So on one hand, they were used to very stringent, strict, you're lucky to be here and, just deal with any challenges. But there are a lot of people that would like your job right now. So if you don't want it, you can leave any minute now. And that's evolved. And even, working early in my career, I think the other flip side was there was a time where work-life balance for some people was automatic because if I worked for a global manufacturer and they were basically hourly employees that punched in and out every day, punch in the morning, punch out for lunch, punch back in after lunch, punch out at the end of the day, they're home. Even the white collar workers, there were no tablets or PCs or mobile phones. And so your time was in the office. And if you wanted to be recognized and known as a hard worker, which would only show that I'm working longer hours, I'm able to deliver results, and then get my opportunity for, promotion or advancement, you had to be in the office 10 hours a day. And, hey, a 3-hour Saturday or a 3-hour Sunday, 4-hour Sunday, that wasn't out of the question. You could work from home, but you were bringing a paper file home, with your notepad and your briefcase. And literally that's how, things started. So I think over time, as things have evolved, my generation also over the last 10, 15 years took their experiences and expected others to follow suit. So if I saw Rhett working 10, 11 hours a day, and I was getting emails and text messages and phone calls, my unconscious bias would automatically say, oh, he's working hard. He deserves, this next opportunity. So don't get me wrong. There are some people that thrive on, achievement. They thrive on, hey, I want to do the best I can. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to give 120%. Those things are always going to happen. But what we then found out was there was a lot of burnout, which led to job dissatisfaction, which led to people resigning, retiring early, whatever the case was. And so I think a lot of these things really need to be managed, moving forward. And we need to really accept the different norms because it works differently for every person. And if we understand that, then we can obviously, do the best we can from a productive perspective.
So based on that, let me ask you, do you think that the view of work-life balance for your generation has evolved? Do you think that the majority, and again, I'm asking you to speak in generalizations, right? But you do a lot of consulting, you've worked, at a lot of large corporations. Do you think that as the younger generations or work-life balance has become more of a real thing, Do you feel like that mindset has changed, or do you still feel like boomers only think in general, of course, that if you're not working 80 hours a week, you're not promotion material? I mean, just speak to that maybe from your perspective.
Right. I'll say it's probably 60-40. So 60% of the people are still going to hold on to the values that they feel got them to where they are. And when they're asked about how can I, advance in my career, they'll give them that information. I would say the other 40% are the more progressive, leaders out there that are recognizing, just like in any sports, situation, the general manager has to pick the best team. And then it's that coach that is really saying, okay, what's going to drive? Because candidly, what will drive Chris and what will drive Rhett and Jeremy and whomever is all a little bit different. And if I want to be an effective coach, right, and lead my team, if I can understand those dynamics for the three of you individually, then I'm going to get the best out of you. So again, I don't have any statistics to say that, but my gut feel is 60% are still holding on to this is what got me where I was, so I want to see it out of everyone else. And 40% are saying I need to adapt because it is 2024.
Well, and I'm just going to reiterate that one of the best books I've ever read is What Got You Here Won't Get You There. So if you know of anybody who's stuck or, thinks that how they've always done it is how it's going to always be, that book is very illuminating. I've learned a lot of lessons by reading that book. Jeremy, Rhett, any thoughts before we move forward on anything that Mark said?
Yeah, that really resonated with me. I think folks in their 40s, late 30s, maybe even early 50s, right? Our leadership tends to be Mark's age or Chris's age, or but you juxtapose that against the teams we're leading, right? Which are oftentimes millennials or Gen Z. And there's a balancing act there, I think. You called out the fact that you were surprised 60% wasn't higher. In a job search myself right now, work-life balance is not a critical element for me. Culture is. The work environment, who you get to work with, who you get to show up with every day, that really resonates with me. But the notion of work-life balance, and I think that's from having grown up, watch dad put on a suit and tie every day, right?
Right.
Go to work, and my leadership has always been the generation above me, right? And that was, to Mark's point, highly valued. Can they see you? And I think we're seeing that in that return to the office kind of push right now too, is can we see people? But I think there's an interesting give and take there for, I hate to call myself middle management, right? But for the late 30s, 40-year-old, because you're trying to balance that traditional way of thinking and evaluating and trying to tease out who your super top performers are. And the folks that we're leading, who are 100% looking for that solid balance and wanting somebody to kind of push them to take their CTO or their PTO, and it's interesting. So that kind of hit home, Mark, as you were talking about that, is how do you play that balancing act between the generations?
Yeah, and I want to circle back to what you said about that not being as high on the priority list as you're looking for a job. But before we do that, Rhett, any thoughts from you on what Mark had to say?
Yeah, I would say it's important, even for my generation, or maybe even more important, to understand the generations above you and what they value, and to understand that as we all balance these things, and I'll get to this later and some of my other points, but balance doesn't always necessarily mean you're doing the same thing, right? If there's a big project or something that we're really working on and I want to stick out, I may be putting in those extra hours because I know that Mark is part of a generation that really respects hard workers, right? If the team is suffering, I want to be one of the guys that's up front. Right. And so I think it's important to understand what's important to you and don't lose sight of that or give it up. necessarily, but be ready for when the opportunity comes to take advantage of certain situations, I would say.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Um, okay, let's move forward to Gen X, right? Which is 1965 to 1980. You know, somehow, Jeremy, you and I fall into the same category, right? Even though we're decades apart in age. But, you know, based on that article, you know, us Gen Xers watched our parents work long hours. We recognized that we weren't getting the focus of their time. And while we may have had a good quality of life, a lot of times you see, especially on TikTok or Instagram, Gen X is called the forgotten generation because we weren't closely supervised. There was no technology to track us, right? We were kind of on our own. And in general, our generation wants the best of both worlds. We want to work hard, we want to show that effort, but we also want that flexibility so that we don't miss anything. I'm curious, kind of based on what you said earlier and the conversations that you and I have had, frankly, about, you know, as your former boss, pushing you to take your vacation time, right? Have you evolved that thought? And if it's not at the top of your list, kind of where does it fit, and you know, how do you feel like that tracks with us both for yourself and then as a generation?
I think probably the healthiest work-life balance that I've had professionally was probably that stint at we'll call it the company with a capital A. Yeah. where we all work together. And I call that out specifically because you know, for my teams, it's really important for me to say, hey, you know, especially in the world where we've got PTO, right? Unlimited time off. That's the big buzz phrase. And, you know, Lord, don't get me started on that because there's a whole can of worms there too. But you know, particularly in that environment, when I bring new folks on the team, I try really hard, and maybe Rhett, you can attest to this, you know, to push folks. Hey, I want you to take a couple weeks off in the spring. I want you to take a couple weeks off in the fall, right? Like it's important for me that the team does that. And as a leader, in theory, at least, right, you want to model that behavior. And the reason I call out our stint at that company in particular, I think because having you in a leadership position to push that, to make sure it was okay, right, for your directors and executive director, and you know, to feel comfortable that we could take time off. I think that's super important, because I could juxtapose that with a recent experience where, you know, I watched senior leadership, you know, essentially ridicule folks that took time off, and it created a culture of I don't want to be on the receiving end of that, right? So we ended up in a position where I don't want to take time off, but I still know personally as a leader, it's super critical for my teams to take time off, right? So I'm pushing them to take time off, but they're not seeing me take time off, and it creates a little bit of a rub, right? So I think the best environment you can have is that instance where, you know, top down, executive team, senior leadership, management, individual employees, they all recognize you work hard, you play hard, right? You can only do 10-hour days, 8-hour days, 12-hour days, you know, long enough before you need a little bit of time to recharge. And I think the best environments are where that comes from the top down. So that would be my take on that. You know, it's still a hard one for me. You get into the, you know, the remote environment in particular. I've been remote since 2000. I've been managing remote teams, probably since 2017. They're dispersed. They're spread across the time zones. You know, for me, it works really well to jump into like a 6 to 6 cadence, but I'm in a senior leadership role, right? As a department head, I want to be available to my teams. I want to be available to my customers. And that's where my comfort level is at this point in my career, at, you know, the salary, where the salary is. That's what I'm comfortable with. And it's really hard for me to come up with a better balance than that. And I know you and I go back and forth on this all the time. It's not an expectation I would have for my teams. I certainly don't expect my teams to work like that. but it works well for me. And I don't know where that comes from. If that's from a stage in life, I had a household. I've got fortunately got 5 wonderful kids, 40 goats, 40 chickens, a wife that manages the farm and educates the kids, and it's phenomenal. But that kind of puts the work, the earner mentality on me, and I like that. We get to be the provider for the family, and I like that role. So it never really jumps out at me and occurs to me to ask, even in a job search situation, what's the work-life balance look like? Because I like work. So I don't know. What's your take on that? I feel like I went on a little bit of a tangent there, but what's your take on that? Because particularly at the leadership level, right there, I think there's an expectation that it's no longer a 40-hour-a-week job.
Yeah, I think
Thoughts?
it's fair. I think I had to learn it over time. I came from an entrepreneurial background where you just kind of ground it out and worked and you just kept going. And you and I have gone on many business trips and done that, or called each other at 11 o'clock at night and did what we needed to do. But, back at the company, before the company with an A, I had a boss who was very, very, and it wasn't Mark, by the way, it was the boss before Mark. But he was very insistent that we make sure we take our time off, but he was terrible at taking his time off. And I had finally, if we go back to our mentor conversation, I felt like I was close enough to talk to him. And I said, you're leading by example, and your example is you never take time off, and you're always answering your emails. Even if you're 15 hours ahead, if I send you a text or an email, you're answering it in 30 seconds, which sets the expectation for someone like me or someone like you that I have to do it too. Even if I'm, they're saying, take your time off, take your time off. And I do genuinely think it's meant. So for me, as someone who's kind of grown through that need to always be online to show I'm a good boy, or my tail's wagging, or I'm working hard, I've found that if I pull back just a little bit, I'm a better employee. Right. And I would say, respectfully challenge you a little bit to think about, if you're not doing it for yourself, look at the perspective that you're giving your team, because they're watching what you're doing too. And you don't want to create that sense of guilt or fear that, yeah, he's saying that, but he never does it. So is he really watching me because I work all the time? Right. So to me, it's something to think about. But I think for our generation, just like with technology, and a lot of things, we're kind of that sandwich generation where, we started pre-technology, we grew up into technology, and now we're kind of into it. I think that's the same thing with work-life balance, right? Is that, yes, we do want to have it all, but to Mark's point, even when my kids were little, I didn't have as much technology as we do now to be able to be everywhere, right?
True.
But my opinion on that has evolved quite a bit. I want my time. I want to work hard when I'm in the office, but if I'm off, I'm off. I mean, I'll talk later about some of the things that I did to help separate those things. That doesn't mean I had to say this to myself, so maybe I'm saying it out loud to you as well. It doesn't mean I don't care, or I'm not passionate about my job, or I'm not a hard worker. But I think I'm not as effective if I'm always grinding, right?
Mhm.
Or putting the kids to bed at 9 o'clock and working until 1 in the morning because I feel guilty that I went to a football game, or I watched a soccer game, or I finger painted with the kids. I don't want to feel like that. Right. So to me, I've had to change my mindset. It is not always easy, but it has changed over time. So I don't know if that resonates with you, or Mark, Rhett, you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah.
I want to hear some concepts from Rhett.
From me. Yeah. So
Well, we're going to
I'll
get to the
say,
millennials in a second, but kind of sticking with,
Yeah.
two Gen Zers. You've had two Gen Zers as a boss, right? You've got a Gen Zer
Right.
now as a boss. Or sorry, keep saying Gen Z, Gen X.
Right.
How does that sit with you based on how, like me as your boss, it's several times, Jeremy
Yeah.
as your boss, did we do as we said, not as we do, or did we follow through?
Yeah. So what I'll say is it's interesting knowing both sides, right? Because I have older parents and an entrepreneurial family and everything. So I understand, nose to the grindstone, get the job done. I do. I get it, right? But I also very much understand my generation and the points that I'm going to get to later about why we maybe think the way that we do or appear the way that we do, right? But what I'll say to your guys' points about taking time off, I'll tell you, nothing made me feel better or like we were in a good spot or like I was doing a good job or that our team was prepared was then when Jeremy could go off for 2 weeks and come back and everything was fine. When you could actually take time off and come back and things were fine and you'd hear back, hey, so-and-so did really good, right? Like that's more of a pat on the back than any day when I get a attaboy. So I would say, sometimes it even helps make your team stronger and stress test it a little bit, right? If you're able to take time off, that's what you're trying to do is build the process better.
That's a great point. Mark, anything to add to that before we move to the millennials?
I was just going to say, and Rhett demonstrated that in June of 2022 for me, when there was, upon my return from a 2-week time away, where someone had said, hey, we had a little hiccup, but Rhett jumped right in and took care of things. Instead of, it would have been very easy to send a text message and say, hey, can you call me for 5 minutes? So, no, I agree. It does, you have to set the example. And I have a couple of other examples of where I had to learn that earlier in my career, back in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, right.
I like your take on that too, Chris. The conversation you had with your leadership, right? That coaching up. Because I think that's super important, and Rhett touched on it. I think for anybody in a leadership position, that time away, that time out of office, how do we? I still remember, Rhett, we kicked that off one year as there was a critical project that needed to get done while I was out. I was going on a camping trip, and it was an opportunity for my leadership team to step up and sit at the table with the senior leadership team and the directors. And it was a phenomenal opportunity, right? Like I wouldn't I love my camping trip, but I wouldn't have for anything under the sun taken that opportunity away from them, right? That was a chance for them to step up and shine, which is wonderful, right? And you need that. And I think even folks, in Chris and you're at my level, we need that as well, right? Our leadership team should feel comfortable being out of the office and, to some extent, passing the reins on, right? Let us step up, let us take charge. And I like the idea of coaching that upwards, right? It's important because if you don't see it, if you're not seeing it happen in practice, it is a hard hurdle to overcome I know they said take it, but I don't see them doing it. And so,
and I'm sorry, go ahead, Rhett.
No, I was going to say it's Chris, you and I have heard this a lot of times recently from companies too, on how they're looking for, what's the phrasing? You can correct me or not, but it's not necessarily that they don't have the talent, but they're looking for someone to almost step into the position type of thing. Mm-hmm. What was it? I think you were interviewing with a company recently. And it was essentially, we have a lot of people in the positions, but we don't know if they're ready for the next step type of thing. Right. And this type of opportunity where you take the time and you can see when push comes to shove, if someone's going to step up and kind of take the reins, then you can say, hey, promotion time comes around. I think you can handle your own team. You seem to do a good enough job. Right.
I agree with everything you guys are saying. One thing, though, that I want to point out to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, when we talk about work-life balance, it isn't 2-week chunks necessarily too. Yes, you should take your vacation time because that does give you balance, but it's also being okay to go to a dentist appointment, going to a doctor's appointment. Your kid's got to play at 2:00 in the afternoon and you've got a meeting. It makes you uncomfortable, but you should do it anyway. Because those things are never going to come back. And it isn't just about kids. Maybe you like walking your dog needs a walk, whatever it is, that one class that you've always wanted to take is always at 2:00 on Thursdays. Take the damn class, and if you do a good job, if you work hard, that will come back to you, in my opinion. Not everywhere and not 100%. But to me, if you're a good employee, you should be able to take time off in the day, during the day, part of the day, come in late, whatever it is, and still step up and perform because overall you are a better balanced person. Just my 2 cents. Okay, great discussion. Let's keep moving. Rhett, you're our millennial representative, and based on the definitions we're using, millennials are 81 to 96. Just squeaked into the millennials, by the way, almost a Gen Zer. But based on this article, your generation craves even more than just work-life balance. You crave integration, which means you want to work from home, you want to have flexible hours, you want to use the technology, you want to be able to use all that and kind of balance it out. And, I've talked about how in the past you're more like an old soul. I think that's why we all get along so well. But, in all seriousness, I think there is an incorrect perception out there that because millennials speak up, they put barriers in, they have boundaries, that there is a laziness or they're not as hardworking as older generations. I have not found that in my experience, right? I think across the board, Gen Zers all the way through, you can have everybody be hard workers or they phone it in, but from your experience, again, we're talking about great generalizations here.
Right.
Beside, with you and your counterparts, how do you feel about that, right? Do you feel like there's more work-life balance or is it more you're craving it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I'll definitely say I think there's a perception of my generation that we don't necessarily work hard, but I'm sure as the gentleman on this call can attest to, there are definitely plenty of times when I am working just as hard, if not way harder than a lot of people that are maybe even older than me, right? So I'd say it's not a hard and fast rule by any means. And I also have a lot of friends that are working extremely hard, that are in finance, that are used to working 80, 90-hour weeks, right? And they're really tunneling in. So I don't think it's necessarily always about the amount of work you're doing, but I will say, I think my generation doesn't generally like inefficiency and tackling a problem with brute force because of all the new technology that we have gotten, especially when we were joining the workforce, and how those improvements had so much of an impact on what one individual could do, right? And complete efficient work compared to maybe previous tactics. Take the internet, for example, right? Something that I kind of found out about early adolescence or whatever, but it changed the world, right? Tasks that took minutes or hours now took seconds, like that, done. All of a sudden, the whole industry knocked out by this invention. Being able to kind of handle that new development and how do you get it into the workplace? Take the pandemic, for example, which really hit a lot of businesses hard, but a lot of businesses that said we could never be brick and mortar, all of a sudden people are operating from home. So there have been a lot of different industries and technologies that we've either joined the workforce into or been a part of now for a little bit that we really like efficiency and figuring out a way to get it done rather than necessarily just always doing it the way it has been done. Yeah, I think all that to say, definitely don't think we have a lazy generation, but we have a lot of good examples of how previous generations have done things and how they can possibly be different and done differently now, right?
And I would add in autonomy there. I had a lot of success with you guys in particular, the four or five managers that I had on the team. I think Rhett, you might have been the youngest, but I think pretty close in age there.
Yeah.
And having the autonomy to just do what needs to be done, right? Is we kind of set boundaries. Here's how we communicate. Here's how we get in hold of each other when there's an urgent issue. But by and large, if you need to come in an hour late, if you're running to the doctor, if you need to take a 2-hour lunch, we're not curing cancer, we're not babysitting. Like if you're getting your job done, and without a doubt, I mean, Rhett very well could have taken 2 hours off in the middle of the day, and he might have well worked until 6 o'clock to get the report out that we needed at the end of the day. But I think that resonates. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Rhett, but I think that resonates with that generation as well. Is, hey, I will get this done. I'll blow your socks off, but I don't need somebody to hold my hand all day long to get that done.
Yeah, I never told you about how much I wasn't working. That was on purpose. But no, all that to say, I have the same kind of idea with a lot of my employees that I've had, right? If we have a goal and we're hitting that goal and you're doing it in 7 hours instead of 8 without interfering with anything, right? You're still available if there's an emergency, and you're able to do it, and we're not asking more from you. Great. Good. Happy you're getting, teach the rest of my team so that we can all get an hour back and we can put it towards something else. Right?
Because there are going to be times, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I mean to cut you off, but there's going to be times when you do have to work 50 or 60 hours. A project demands it. But if you're already working 60 or 70 hours and then you've got to add that time on top of it, that's where you tend to burn out, right? So it is like a bank. You said it perfectly, I think.
Well, and you're also setting an expectation, right? If you come in and you immediately start working 50, 60 hours and you never stop, the second you go back to 40, what's going to happen, right? Jeremy, we talked about this all the time, because we did at one point have people who were working hours and again, times there where that's going to happen. But once we got over that hump and people were still working untold hours, we were just essentially short-sighting ourselves because we were getting the job done without bringing more people on board. And so everyone was just overworked rather than everyone working 8 hours and us getting 6 more people on the team, right?
That's right. Yeah. From a leadership perspective, that can be really challenging from a resource forecasting standpoint.
Yeah.
You're 100% right. I don't know how many times we talked about that with the team. Hey, we need to know if you're going above and beyond, if you're doing more than 50 hours, tell us, because otherwise we're basing our level of effort estimates against our seasonality formulas on work product and work effort, and we're off, right? Like, hey, we needed 3 more headcount or everybody's going to have to work 50-hour weeks. So no, that's a great call out there, Red. Is big thumbs up if you're able to do it when times necessitate it. But if that continues, it does play into the calculus for how many people you need on your team, how much work can get done in a specific amount of time. That's a great call out.
The one comment that really struck me from Red's comment was, quote, the lazy, right? We're not a lazy generation. I think that is a very poor perception based on 1 or 2 sound bites. And it's really an example of where management is probably afraid to have that uncomfortable conversation. Because again, I think we all have more than enough experiences where, smarter, faster beats long hours any day of the week. And like, Red commented, if I can find a way to do something in 6 instead of 9 hours, then that gives us that opportunity. So again, I think, so many of these things weave together, but you'll hear me saying this next little segment, you've got to have the conversation. You got to be in alignment. And we can't take 1 or 2 examples and then all of a sudden make that the complete narrative for everything. Well,
and I think, one of to me, the foundations of this podcast is learning from each other, right? Learning from the generations. And, I took a bit of a sabbatical here, if you will, like for the last 3 or 4 months, and I'm starting to dip my toe back into the working world. I'm starting to apply for jobs, starting to interview. For me, work-life balance is towards the top. And I've learned that from the younger generation to say, what do you expect of me? Yes, I have a high-profile job. Yes, my salary is not the average salary, all of that. But what is the expectation back, right? And it starts to make it a bi-directional conversation about work rather than just here's all the things I can do for you. I don't want it to be here. What are you just going to do for me? But to me, having that work-life conversation, which again, I've learned from people younger than me based on the questions they've asked me, the expectations they have, I've embraced it. I still think I'm an effective employee. I still think I'm going to give a hell of a lot more than the average, leader. But does that mean I have to give everything until I'm wrung out like a sponge? I don't think it does anymore, right? So, all right. We've talked about our experiences with work life. I want to kind of switch gears a little bit to how do you start driving towards that balanced experience? And again, I want to reiterate, balance does not mean equal. It's not 1 hour play for 1 hour of work. It just doesn't quite work like that. But Mark, I've said this a couple of times. Work-life balance doesn't mean equal time, right? For example, if you have a big project at work, we talked about this, you have to work longer. Or if you've got a sick kid or a sick dog or you're sick, you have to take time off. So if it isn't a question of being equal, maybe starting with you, what are some of those look-fors that you want to define your own work-life balance?
So part of it is situational awareness. And I think you've all said the same thing here that, there are times where those projects are going to come up and it's going to take a little bit more time and focus on those from that perspective. The second thing is then, by engaging with your managers and your leadership and coming in alignment. I have a story from probably 2008 where one of my employees sent me an email at midnight saying, hey, my flights were delayed. I just got home. And is it okay if I'm not in the office by 8 a.m.? And, very graciously, first thing in the morning when I woke up and saw it, I was like, if you're looking at this, I don't want to see you till 10, 11, maybe even noon. And I explained to this person, I said, no one sees the extra hours of travel and the flight delays and all those other elements. And, when you're sitting alone in a hotel room, you're spending an extra 2 hours because you're bored and you just don't want to watch TV. That's your time. And even in my own experiences with my business travel, that was my time, because then when I did get home with 3 children, I was able to take that. And so, again, there's going to be that give and take. It is a two-way, kind of a two-way street on it. I was very fortunate in my career that even with the hard charging software companies I was with and everything, I had great leadership. They encouraged me to coach. They said, you may not be able to get to every school performance, but if you're home in Denver and you need to leave at 4 o'clock so you can coach your son's, soccer team or your daughter's soccer team, you need to be there. And to an earlier point that, you had made, Chris, and even Jeremy, that was demonstrated because my VP ended up coming to a 7 a.m. hockey game. He walked with me watching my daughter play golf at his home course. And those are the examples that I tried to then pay that forward, from that perspective. I do a lot of collaboration with Gen Z today. My work through my alumni association as the alumni leader here in Denver and Colorado. And especially to Jeremy's earlier point, a lot of managers, they're the ones that are leading, these new first line managers are Gen Z, right? So you've got to adapt to that. And again, you've got to give that latitude to folks that, hey, if you need to take that hour and a half, you need to recharge. To Jeremy's earlier point, I was in the same situation. 80% of my employees were on the East Coast. So it was not uncommon for me to start my days at 7 a.m. But during the summer at 4 o'clock, I'd go to the practice range because I also knew that later on that evening, I was going to wrap up any loose ends and start my planning for the next day. And even talking with a lot of, again, the, people 30 and under that are moving into Denver, they're coming here for a quality of life. They want the outdoor sports of hiking and, skiing and 300 days of summer. And even as I've, worked and coached and collaborated with them, I tell them, have the conversation. Because if you get into an organization and that's not being embraced, you're going to leave within 6 to 9 months. That whole great resignation or quiet quitting, I think Jeremy made that comment earlier. That was all the result of you told me one thing, and now I'm experiencing something different. And what I really envy about that generation, because I was told, appreciate having a job and, don't look a gift horse in the mouth per se. I know that's an old saying, but these folks are saying, you know what, if in 9 months it's not working for me, I'm going to find something else because I know it's out there. So those are just some experiences that, again, situational awareness. There's a time to, play, and there's a time to work, and sometimes you need to work a little harder from that. And I know with that, again, company with the A, that RTS timeframe or BTS timeframe, it was all hands on deck. People were putting in godly amounts of hours because we saw what the impact was, not only to our customer, but to their customer. And those are the things that you then have to pull back and say, you know what, it's Friday afternoon, 2 o'clock. I don't want to see anyone right now. I don't want to see anyone online. Go enjoy a beautiful summer day or a spring day.
Yeah, no. And I think as we're kind of talking through this, you always have to put your own layer of experience on it. But one of the things I like about the podcast is we're trying to give you some things, like if you're struggling with this, we want to give you some tips. Mark outlined kind of at the macro level, this is what you should be thinking about. But we try to do a little bit of research here, and we found a great website. If you haven't been to Coursera, it's a great website. It's got a lot of free classes and a lot of certifications. It's really cool. But they have a great 5-step process, which again was harder to find than you would think, to help you find your balance. We're going to go through these quickly, and I'm going to kind of look to each of us to add a little imprint here. But the first one is evaluate what you're working on when, right? So that means, do you spend most of your work time and free time working or thinking about work? If so, you probably have an imbalance at work. Conversely, if you're playing Fortnite till 3 o'clock in the morning and you're not getting up and getting your work done, you might have an imbalance in your personal time. So keep looking at that to make sure that that pendulum hasn't swung too far one way or the other. Mark, I'm going to start with you. From your perspective, how do you go about evaluating what you're working on?
So I think, again, it's just what level of responsibility are you taking for the project? And in a lot of cases, everyone's working in a collaborative manner on the projects. So address those things with the team. Recently, I had a conversation with someone of my generation saying, gee, their son gets on the 8 o'clock call, and then they're back to bed for another hour and a half. And I was like, well, everyone has a different time when they're in the flow. And if his in the flow is, like most software developers, in non-traditional 8 to 5 timeframes, so what? They're getting their job done. If anything, they're excited about that time. And, so again, I think it's just understanding the dynamics of the individuals. Let them work when they work best, when they're in that flow. And, especially working with early stage companies, there's a lot of different hats people are working or wearing so they can get the job done. But again, there has to be that understanding and being able to say, what is it I'm going to do? But also make sure that you've got strong enough management to say, gee, why are you always delayed in the morning? You just don't seem with it. Well, I'm playing Fortnite till 3 a.m. Well, let's talk about what behaviors and habits might you want to change, because you may be letting other team members down, from that perspective. So again, for me, it's always open, honest, strong communications amongst everybody.
Yeah, great. All right. The second thing then would be to assess what's important, right? Take a look at what's really important to you and focus on whether you're doing enough of it and whether you have enough time to engage in it. Jeremy, you've got some unique hobbies, right? How do you balance that out? Talk about that a little bit. How are you assessing what's important, especially, now in this place of transition for both of us, right? We're transitioning into new jobs, new careers, perhaps. How do you assess what's important as you're looking at that?
Oh, sure. Probably the same way we look at it from a professional perspective, right? If everything's an emergency, then nothing's an emergency, right? If everything in your life is a priority, then nothing's a priority. So how do you whittle down to those things that are really important to you? I do try really hard to not define myself by my job or by my career, but at the same time, my ability to provide for the family is really important to me. Like, that's a high priority item for me. So I do tend to place a premium on work, but at the same time, there's so much fun stuff happening, right? Like we've got the ranch, I've got kids aged 5 through 18. We've got a lot of stuff going on, and I don't want to miss those elements. And there's I think a component of that remote work that allows for some of that, right? I can have 2 hours of work under my belt, and I can have a quick breakfast with folks, with the kids. Can pop home for lunch if meeting schedules permit. And I tend to be really protective over my time. 6 to midnight is my time, right? If there's an emergency, sure. But I want to be protective over that time. It's my opportunity to spend time and make and eat dinner and take care of stuff that needs to get taken care of around the ranch. Really, really important to me. And as you know, the once a year I do try. I failed at it the last 2 years, but I do try to take that 2 week period of just disappearing up into the mountains, right? Like you
Right.
can see my mountains behind me here. I love it being able to just disconnect and unplug and have a campfire, and you know, that kind of re-energizes me. That's my balancing act. And I think we talked about it earlier. If you can set up your teams and stuff that way, it's a really good positive thing being out of the office and having your team step up and give them that visibility from a leadership perspective. So, but you gotta have support for that up and down the chain, right? Everybody needs to be pushing the same direction to provide for that. But I don't know that
Yeah, but if
answered
you
your.
establish it and make it a priority, it does tend to balance itself out, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, what's the old cliche? Nobody remembers at the end of the day what you did, right? What they remember is who you are. Um, I do take that into consideration, right? I want to be the best dad that I can be to the kids, and the best husband I can be, the best goat birthing parent I can be. But make a difference for the people that work for me too, like that.
That did make my top 5. Yes. But see, that's the great thing
really
about assessing what's important, right? I think that's terrific. All right, let's keep moving on here. The third thing is build a schedule and manage your time more effectively. Having a schedule and blocking out that time, again, whether it's vacation or a dentist appointment or simply having 15 minutes to meditate in the morning is important. Rhett, talk a little bit about that from, your perspective and how do you do that?
Yeah, so I have both a work and a personal schedule. And I would say for my work schedule and for most people's work schedules, you should definitely be blocking out time. Well, I guess you don't have to block out time, but I block out time to make sure that the most important things get done, right? If you're the person who runs payroll every week, you better make sure you block out some time so that all 50 people in the company get paid, right? And the reason you need to do that is because that is one of the activities that if you don't do it, you're probably going to have to stay late to do it. You can't just not pay 50 employees, right? So that's one of the examples where you need to block out time and make sure that you're getting it done. In my personal life, I make sure to plug in those activities that are going to re-energize me, right? Things like working out, things like trying a new skill, things like watching a new show that I've wanted to watch, right? So that I can re-engage the next day at my full force at work, right? Because I tend to be an overthinker, shocking for everyone here. And so constantly work can get in my mind if I'm not focusing on actually enjoying the activities that I'm doing outside of work. And then I guess my final point here as far as scheduling is I think if you're really struggling with work-life balance, a schedule can really help you if you stick to it, right? And that's what I would say is try to find a schedule you can stick to. And if you can't stick to it, change it and try to stick to that one. Because then you can use your schedule as your cutoff, right? And I think, Chris, you might get to this point as well, right? But you're like, hey, I have to do this activity, whatever it is, going to work out or spending time with my kids or whatever it is, because that's part of my schedule.
Right? No, 100%. Okay, the fourth thing would be to establish boundaries. And I'm going to speak to this a little bit just because for me, I know personally it was easier said than done. But one of the boundaries I started to set was not responding to emails at all hours of the night. To Mark's point earlier, when or Slacks or texts. I mean, we have all kinds of ways to communicate. We did have some nocturnal teams at our previous company that would ping you at 10 o'clock at night or 5 o'clock in the morning, and we had East Coast teams. It was really hard for me at first not to answer. But what I found was it built the expectation that I was always available, right? So I had to start putting those boundaries in, right? So that I limited my availability. The thing you got to do with that is just make sure that everybody knows your boundary, right? It's not like, hey, I'm not taking emails from 12 to 5, but it's more like, I'm not going to answer at 6 o'clock unless it's an emergency. And work with your employer, work with your partner, work with your friends, whomever you're building these boundaries with, to say, what constitutes an emergency? What time we're having lunch tomorrow is not an emergency to me, right? So what does do that? So you are available, again, blending that balance so it's not this hard all or nothing. Right. And then kind of the fifth thing, if you think about all these things and everything that we have talked about over this whole podcast, it's continuing to reflect, refine, and repeat. Look at what's happening. Look at what you're doing. Reflect on where you've been and where you're going, and continue to adjust that as you go. And if you do that, I think you're going to be really successful at a work-life balance. Before we wrap up the podcast, really quick, from each of you, I'd like to get a sense of maybe an example of how you found better balance. Jeremy, let's start with you. Or you're working towards finding better balance.
Again, just I've shared enough kind of about the way that I think about these things. And for me, I need somebody in a leadership position above me that mirrors that behavior, right? That will call me, and I'm going to pick on you again, right? Will call me and say, hey, I need you to be off the next 2 weeks. Right? I feel like we did some December. Hey, you've got 2 weeks left and you haven't taken it. You got to take it now. That's good. I need somebody doing that for me, and I try to do that for my teams, right? Because it's super important. So I think that helps. The boundary issue I thought was a great one that you brought up there, Chris. One of the neat things that we had in the past was a work cell phone. And I know nobody likes carrying two cell phones, right? But having a work cell phone and a personal cell phone, at the end of the day, whenever that end of the day was, being able to put that down and leave it somewhere made a huge difference. Right. And that's probably a whole nother topic, right? About, availability and, but the one thing that I found with the remote work environment and managing teams in a remote work environment is that people tend to overdo it. The focus I've had to have with folks on my team is, how do you rein it in? How do you make sure you're taking lunch every day? Because you don't have that commute time. You don't have that unwinding time. You don't, very often you're dealing with people that are working, 10-hour days or more and haven't stood up once throughout the day. It's not a good, I guess if we take it all the way full center back, that's not a good balance, right? That's not a good balance within your workday. So carving things out, like Rhett said, carving things out on your calendar, even taking a meeting. One of my favorite things was to take a meeting while we were walking.
Yeah. We used to walk a lot. You touch on my example a little bit. You talked about the separate phones. We don't all get the advantage of having two phones, but one of the things that I learned at my last organization is I could drive my work Gmail to Outlook, and I had my personal Gmail and Gmail. So they literally came up as different colors and had different sounds, because the problem I had is when they were all in one inbox, I couldn't distinguish. So at 11 o'clock at night, that could be my daughter, could be work, I don't know, right? So I pulled those things apart. So for me, that really helped me distinguish and go, that can wait versus that's important, right? So to me, that's an example of how I've kind of brought that separation in, and it gives me that peace of mind that I can have dinner or I can focus. Rhett, what's your example?
Yeah, so for me, I personally found that my balance, quote unquote, is less of everything is always equal and more of I prioritize things when I need to, right? So more of an actual balancing act that comes with an ebb and flow, so I can focus on what I need to make sure that I'm getting the job done. So for those of you that are trying to do this, right, focus on what you need to do to get the best out of yourself in all aspects. Be ready to shift into, hey, this activity that I thought was going to be super fun and make me feel good makes me miserable. Maybe when you play golf, you hate your score and it makes you very upset and you don't like it anymore. It's not working for you. Try something new. You have to find something. I love golf, by the way, and so does Mark. But anyways, to that point, right, you need to be doing those activities that help you recharge and be able to tackle the next day just as strong as you were, right? Including scheduling that activity. So set it, but don't be afraid to change it.
Good point. And Mark, from your perspective?
Yeah, I would say when I work with managers, I really try and encourage them to foster the conversation and establish the agreed upon norms. So for example, and I think you both have raised it, or all three of you have raised it earlier, if I'm in a flow, I had to learn to say, you know what, I'm not going to send this email at 10 o'clock at night or 10:30 at night. I'm going to wait until the morning, because I don't want people to feel like they've got to respond to it. And unfortunately, this, wonderful little device is always on with us for the most part. So I think, again, it's just establishing the norms, understanding when are things working and when are they not, and don't be afraid to have the conversation.
Yeah, that's right. And Mark is holding up a phone for those of you who are listening. So just, All right, Red, I'm going to ask you to take us home here and wrap up the podcast. Can you tell us about the main takeaways from the conversation today?
Absolutely. The main takeaways for today are: define what work-life balance means to you. It's going to be a little bit different to everyone, right? Find your piece there. Define what is important. Build a plan, schedule, and boundaries. And then know it will not always be perfect, and it may not always be comfortable, but if done correctly, you will make yourself a better employee, parent, partner, and friend.
Awesome. All right. As always, thank you to our panel, Jeremy Davidson, Mark Russell, Rhett Suchu. Thank you, guys. This is a pleasure. This was a supersized episode here, but I think we got through a lot of stuff. For those of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Generational Exchange. We hope that this conversation between the generations has sparked some new ideas, helped you see the business world from fresh perspectives, and gives you some things to think about. Don't forget to subscribe for more insightful discussions across the generations. And if you have a burning question you'd like us to tackle, leave us a comment or shoot us an email at cmsrconsulting@gmail.com. Until next week, from all of us here at Generational Exchange, thanks for listening and happy learning.